Okay, we'll leave dreams behind. We will move to space in the Middle East. We have Mathieu Chimino, who is our Marie Curie Fellow here in the Institute, and Nassima Negaz, who is a DL in Islamic History and also an Early Career Fellow, and who is about to leave us for Cardiff. And they are going to talk about revisiting spatiality in Islam. The case of Bartas and Daesh textbooks, yes, so please.
So the format is a little bit different since Mathieu prepared a presentation, so I'll let him start with that and then we'll engage into questions.
So first, good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and present my work at DOI. This work which, as you said, was a 2-year fellowship Marie Curie under the supervision of Professor Rogan at St. Anthony's. And the original title was The Fall of a Colonial Legacy, a Modern History of Syrian Borders, 1920 to 2015. Although I'm going to talk about Daeshi and Baisi textbook, in the second part I also brought some of them so that you can have a visual of this. This work, this project, had two main aspects. The first one it aims to actually write a full monograph on the history of Syrian borders from 1920 to 2011, before the revolution began. When I drafted this project, I realized that there was absolutely, Syrian borders have never been fully investigated by the academic community. There is a lot of work on, of course, the Ottoman, pre-1920, Ottoman borders and boundaries, frontiers as well, Lebanese, Palestinian, but nothing on the Syrian question. There are many reasons for this, but maybe the most important one will be the authoritarian nature of the Syrian regime, the Syrian regime was quite allergic, to use this word, with foreign researchers working on contemporary issues. So I do remember when I was a PhD student, I usually told that my fieldwork in Syria lasted one day. So I was in Lebanon, did my fieldwork, and also in Palestine, Israel. But in Syria, I asked for my research permits. And so, of course, they told me that they will be very, very glad to give it to me, and they are literally struggling to obtain one from their ministries, but they are concerned about my safety, so they couldn't give it to me eventually. So this project probably, interested the European Commission at the moment, post 2011, when the Syrian territory was internally fragmented. Because of the ongoing war, of course, but also because it led to the emergence, or sometimes the re-emergence, of different non-state actors that competed for the control of Syrian territory. Those actors, for example here, the Islamic States and the Kurds, were essentially engaged in a process of contesting the colonial nature of Syrian boundaries. So they actually presented alternative project to the Syrian shape of the border. So this aspect, this first part, is essentially concentrated on the 1920-2011 period, and trying to work on the articulation of the relations between the state and its borders. And how did the Syrian successive governments and the Syrian regime actually internalize those colonial boundaries that were contested from the very beginning, but really rapidly were internalized by the majority of the actors. So that's the first part. And the second aspect of it, which is the title of the presentation today, was not supposed to be a big part of this work, but eventually led to something bigger. It deals with spatial and territorial ideology. So I brought here some of the textbooks, so I printed them like old ways. I'm not going to use a PowerPoint, I'm fed up with PowerPoints, so I can make them circulate. Some of them are geography books, others are history books. So one of the consequences of the post-2011 revolution, post-2011 war, was that the majority of the actors engaged in either state building or nation building processes. As they were in control of large parcel or large portion of territories in the long run, they actually try to engage in those processes. And what I realized by going there and working with those actors was that part of this project was the first thing when you engage in nation or state building process is to reestablish school and to teach. So you will reestablish schools, an educative system, and you will teach. But the first thing that you will do is you will disseminate a vision or a conception of the world. You will disseminate a conception of the world, a nationalistic perception of the reality that is around you. Geography is probably the most important thing to study when you try to build an archaeology of knowledge, because geography inform on the spatial and territorial ideologies of actors, but they contribute to the territorial socialization of actors. They actually profoundly define alterity. How do we define us, and how do we define the other? So I managed to gather many textbooks, Daesh, produced by the Islamic State, and following recommendation of, the advice of Nassima, at first I wanted to work and doing a comparative perspective with the Kurdish movement. But I quickly realized that I didn't speak Kurdish, which was a problem. And so after discussing with Nassima told me, I remember very well, she told me, but why are you not working on the Baas party, which was here before Daesh, and maybe there is something that can be done, the transition process between the Baas and the educative system during the Iraqi and Syrian regime and the transition. So this is what I did. I went to Germany in Braunschweig. There's an institute, the GEI Institute, which actually collects textbooks from all around the world since 1945. So if you need textbook, 1980 textbook, Nepalese textbook, you will find it there. It's really, really, they have a quite important collection. The important thing is that it was easier to find Baasi textbook in Germany than it was in Syria or in Iraq, because they are also here allergic to share them in Syria. So here it is for the global methodology. Maybe very briefly in 2 or 3 minutes, engage with 1 or 2 of the findings before opening to your. So I will share 2 findings. The first one is that it's interesting to see that the Islamic State, by providing a lot of cartographical materials, a lot of maps, they articulated and ordered their own conception of speciality. In appearance, the first finding is that it's quite commonly, it's a vision of the world that will be quite commonly accepted by Islamist movement throughout the 20th century. They essentialized a duopole or dual concept of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Kufr. So the world is divided between 2 entities. Dar al-Islam, the place where Islam remains, the place where Islam is, which is actually the territories controlled by Daesh, and the rest, that is to say everything else, which enters the Dar al-Kufr. But what they probably here managed to the specific reading is that from within the Dar al-Kufr, you will find something which is the Alam al-Islami, the Islamic word, which is part of Dar al-Kufr. So the Islamic word is part of the word of impiety, disbelief. Sorry. So Dar al-Kufr, Al-Alam al-Islami is part of the word of disbelief. Still, there is a specific reading for the Alam al-Islami. It's a space on which Islam exerts a cultural, political, or social influence, distinct temporalities in distinct times, and eventually it needs to be reintegrated into the Dar al-Islam. So they make this very, very interesting triangle, let's say, between Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Kufr, and Al-Alam al-Islami, which is quite specific to Daesh here. The second finding is that although they try to present something which is pre-Westphalian in nature, which contests the idea of a nation-state orienting world, actually they precisely demarcate the territories they're referring to. So for example, Alam al-Islami is precisely mentioned as, for example, between latitudes 1150 degrees southeast of equator, that is to say the widest part of the south of Tanzanian border on the African continent, etc., etc. It's really precisely demarcated. So they actually attribute external borders to their construction, and they also internalized internal borders that are part of multiple ordering of multiple cultural influence that was part of the former Islamic empire. So they recognize external borders, they recognize internal borders. So they actually, like many Islamist groups throughout the 20th century, they integrated what Soleimani or others called banal nationalism. This is the only framework that we have. We try to distance ourselves from this, but we can't. This is a form, this is nationalism. So Daesh is basically nationalism. So I conclude here maybe.
To start with, could you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this topic, and also because your background is also, quite original, going into the study of Syria and Iraq?
I started my PhD was on Lebanese, Syrian, and Israeli territorial dispute, the Sheba farms. So, like many researchers, I think I was dragged into Syria. I was really polarized Lebanon and Israel. And the revolution, 2011, basically led many people to start working on Syria because there was, of course, a lot of things to do and to learn. And the second aspect of it is that I actually found those documents by chance, because I went multiple times on the field and I actually managed to meet with people who were in possession with this. So I started to work on this, and also I discovered this entire field of research, which is textbook research, which is actually it's like border studies. It's a field of research in itself. So a lot of people are working on this.
You've touched on the research and how difficult it can be to do research in Syria and Iraq. Do you have a few, perhaps, things to share on that aspect? Because I know you've been going and you've lived also a little bit in Syria.
Yeah, I used to live in Syria before 2011, before the war, so I actually learned Arabic there. So then as we work on, not the only one, but as we work on border reconfiguration and speciality, territoriality, etc., we usually travel at the borders, at the margins of the state. So now today it's easier to go to, I would say that from the countries bordering Syria, Lebanon is of course the easiest one to go to, although it's quite sealed, the borders itself, they are quite sealed. Turkey is very problematic in a sense that considering the policies towards researchers. Right now, as we speak, there is one French journalist who is in jail, Monsieur Depardon, since I think the beginning of May. Iraq is actually a quite open territory when you could go easily and do your research, especially in the Kurdistani regions, and Jordan as well, of course. Yeah.
So comparing the textbooks under Saddam Hussein and then going into the Daesh state, what are some of the main differences and maybe similarities between those textbooks?
I think that's the key point here. That's really the most interesting point. The question I usually have when I present this work is that what do you know about the people who produced this? What is the meaning which is behind it? Who are they, etc., etc. When I was given those documents from, it was a Kurd, he told me, that's produced by Saudis. They import that in our country. That's, I will spare you the words that he used, but so that's produced by Saudis and import that in our country, which could have been possible actually, because maybe producers of meanings could have been living in Saudi Arabia or France or wherever, and would have tried to develop the entire production of the what we call Diwan al-Ta'lim, that's the Ministry of Teachings and Education. Sorry. So I think this hypothesis is not good. The documents, the real question was, were those documents produced locally and then taught locally, disseminated locally, or were they produced by any form of centralized organization or centralized administrative bureau? I don't have a precise answer, but what I noticed when I was reading those documents, which come from Syria, is that first, the form of the documents, the pages themselves, the summary, everything looks exactly like the Basi school books. The way that I think on some of them you have them, there is a summary with the pages, it's exactly the same. So it's exactly the same. Some of the documents, some of the image are the same as well. So it was probably produced locally, but of course they reinvented it and changed a lot of things, a lot of elements. And there are, at every pages you'll find a reference to Dawla al-Islam or Khilafat al-Islam, etc., so to the Caliphate, to ongoing 2015-2016 events. So I think they are produced locally, and that also explains why they categorize the word using external and internal borders. When you look at Ba'athi textbooks, the idea of the Arab nation, which of course was one of the most important legitimizing tool by the Iraqi and Syrian regime. When you look at the borders of the Arab nation, it's actually, I'm quoting here, I think Potter, I have to check, but those borders are what he calls a secularized Dar al-Islam. That is to say, all the territories that are impacted by Islam transformed into a territory that was called the Arab nation, and that was they essentially concentrate on the Arab nature of the social group, and relinquished Islam. What Daesh did was just to revitalize the Arab nation by coloring it with a religious tone. So it was actually the revitalization of a devitalized Dar al-Islam. So they just actually are, that's why they are, I think they struggle to distance themselves from this notion of nationalism.
Mm-hmm. How does ISIS ground their view of the territory, let's say, within the Islamic tradition? And what types of references did you find often quoted in their propaganda in Dabiq, for example?
That's another element which is I'm working on. There is one article I produced and another one I will follow, and I on this article I will probably need the help of some of you here, especially Paul or others. But it's interesting that they are using very precise terms that were used in the medieval text from Idrisi or other geographers, trying to define what was not only the borders, the boundaries, the frontier, or whatever you want to call it, because it's quite complicated to understand how they perceive the word. But they will use very specific terms that refer to medieval practices. And here, that's right now the point where I'm currently working on this. So I'm trying to extract the way they perceive those references to the Abbasid, for example, or any other empire attempt to construct or to interact at their borders. So I will. Mm-hmm. That's something that will come later.
Sure.
So just some questions if we have remaining few minutes. Sure.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering, in the study of this material, I mean, would you consider it anyhow helpful, like to try and compare these textbooks with textbooks from like other times of history, but even recent history? I remember like my grandma used to show me that she still had her textbook from the times of Mussolini and fascist Italy. So other type of like different types of totalitarian views actually expressed in textbooks. So would that be comparable, or that's like such a completely different phenomenon where you're dealing with that?
It's a good question, because I actually remember myself, I mean, when I was in Germany, the GEI was built probably on the idea also of sharing what was the production of the of the 1933-1945 period. So I read some of them. I tried to read the Nazi textbook, and actually significance probably we can establish bridge here, of course. I should integrate this with any other form of totalitarian, but it's the view or the perspective that I'm trying to focus on here is on the notion of territoriality and spatiality, because that point should be maybe for the articulation between space, state, and power, which is another dimension of the work, which will take another 2 years, so thank you.
Well, you don't have to actually look very far across the border. You're in Israel. I mean, look at there. It's the same thing, nation building, power, territory, space. You have it in the same time, previously, 100 years before. I actually wondered, you talked about the production of knowledge in textbooks. What do we know about the reception of this knowledge these are textbooks. So in an education system such as it was.
It's complicated for many reasons. The first one is that if you want to investigate the reception of those textbooks, you have to, of course, engage in interviews with people who were subject to this. So that is to say, children. So for this, after anti-Daesh group managed to secure territory, usually people flee, they are refugees, and you can interact with them and discuss with them the issue. So on the methodology is quite complicated because it raises a lot of practical but also ethical questions. I know there is a program right now in France, I think in the University of Nantes, where psychologists are trying to meet with children who are subject to this. But the methodology and the process itself is subject to very, very strict control by the French authorities, etc. It's complicated. And on the ethical aspect, I wouldn't go there and start talking with children because I couldn't know how to enter them. But this is part of the project, of course. It's really important.
I'm interested in the distribution of geographical knowledge, partly because I'm thinking specifically to a case which I worked on in the Soviet Union, where you have two very different levels. You have things like the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which is very general, but talks about the quote-unquote territory of the USSR. And then you have the highly restricted military maps, which are extremely detailed, but are definitely not circulated among the public. And so you have quite a sort of small amount, actually, of cartographic material available to the public, and it's very tightly controlled. What you're describing seems to be much more widespread and popularized, and actually encouraging people to really think about the detail of borders and boundaries and space. So is that a contrast that you see, or is there a certain level of restriction? Are they trying to keep it fairly fuzzy so that they can change the boundaries?
I think that they don't have actually so much to invest in. Mental boundaries, they're stuck. Literally stuck. So I don't think that there is so much work to do behind it, like to, let's say, print in the mind of people something that they consider a given. So that I think here is something we can connect to previous questions, that I should and we should investigate the reception of it. And I will be curious to know if they actually produced different maps for different audience. Although I'm pretty sure that everything that is being produced is done on a local basis, personal initiative or personal. But yeah, that's another very, very important question, I think.
One last one.
A lot of the historiography, both in the West and in the Middle East, the bad boundaries that were drawn up by colonialists are often blamed for a lot of the problems, today's problems in terms of conflict. Do the sources that you looked at sort of discuss the process by which the boundaries came about, the modern boundaries came about, and do they take that same line? I mean, is there a kind of post-colonialist or anti-colonialist line in terms of where our borders come from? Because that would seem to militate against this kind of internalization of the boundaries as they ended up.
There are two elements here. The first one, I would say, is that I would say, I will start with something else. I'm part of a generation which will, I think, I attended a workshop recently where everything was about this, but we try to reconsider how exported or imported were those boundaries. It's actually quite significant to see how local actors everywhere from Africa to the Middle East actually sometimes, not in all the cases, but probably sometimes the majority of the cases, actually pushed national mandatory powers to change the nature, the local nature of the boundaries through different strategies and different actions. To me, when we look at the map of the Middle East, 1920, 1916, 1923, let's say map of the Middle East, those boundaries, and it's really time to reconsider how important they were and how we say usually that they are unnatural by nature. That's something that can be seen that way. Actually, they reflect social realities, they reflect cultural realities that were perceived by local actors at the time where powers and mandatory actually drawn those lines. That's the first thing. The second thing is that whatever the nature of those borders, the significance were really internalized by a lot of people. Nationalism, which retrospectively was portrayed, was presented as failed or whatever, actually managed to print in the mind of people the idea that they belong to nationalist Lebanon, nationalist Syria, whatever. And the rest is actually history on the details of the... so that's something which the book, I think, will entirely reconsider.
And with that, we will draw to a close. Can we please say thank you so much?